Now, you've written in the New York Times and elsewhere that the time has come for the United States to talk directly with the Taliban leadership, and you quote a European diplomat on the US stance in Afghanistan: "The US military only wants to talk with their boots on the Taliban's neck." Now, what is so wrong with the US and NATO strategy of building up the Afghan army in order to get to the point where they would counter the Afghanistan insurgency without the presence of international ground troops, while reaching out to the Afghanistan insurgency leaders and its supporters?
It wouldn't be wrong if we had much more time. But it seems to me that for this strategy to be effective, America would have to stay there for at least a decade more, perhaps a generation more. The problem is trying to do this while at the same time telling the world, and the Taliban too listens, that you're going to withdraw ground forces by essentially 2014. Right. There isn't time at that point to build up the Afghan National Army.
Is the Taliban a bit like Al-Qaeda, though, in the sense that it's very decentralised? I mean, the Americans could talk to the Taliban leadership, but what kind of clout would they have on the ground?
To me, the Taliban are actually, by Afghan standards, a remarkably centralised and effective organisation. Okay. I say by Afghan standards, of course.
That's right.
No, I mean, I think that a deal struck with Mullah Omar and his chief lieutenants would stick.
Now, you've written a lot about realism in foreign policy, and you've also written a very good book, what I think is a very good book, on American nationalism, and particularly this notion of American exceptionalism, that America is different from the rest of the world, that it has a special duty to promote democracy and human rights across the globe. To what extent do you think is realism, you know, with its emphasis on national interests, spheres of influence, balance of power, to what extent is that really compatible with America's worldview, especially today, in light of some remarks that President Obama said about American exceptionalism not being so exceptional because there's exceptionalism around the world for other countries?
Yeah, well, there's always been a section of the American policy elites, like Obama, who have wished basically to follow a realist line. Obama in that is very much the heir of Republican presidents like Nixon and Eisenhower. Right. On the other hand, this has been a philosophy in America which has always found it very hard to speak its name, even when this is what they're actually practicing. It's often been necessary to accompany this, like on the other hand Obama in London with his speech, with the rhetoric of American exceptionalism, America leading the world to freedom and democracy. But in practice, of course, there's always had to be this balance. I mean, even when America was making its most exceptionalist noises under Clinton and the second Bush, you saw so many cases where, in the end, America had to negotiate, avoid intervention. Both Clinton and Bush pursued a very pragmatic policy towards China in the end, simply because they realized that America could not afford to, really push China on a number of key issues.
Talking about Barack Obama's foreign policy, not surprisingly, a lot of conservatives and Republicans have been critical of his policy, but so have a lot of liberals, and many liberals in the United States argue that really Obama has not marked the kind of radical departure from the Bush-era foreign policy that many people had hoped, thinking of the failure to close down Gitmo, the surge of US troops in Afghanistan. There are almost double the US troops in Afghanistan. What would you say to that criticism?
You see over Libya a much more cautious US approach. I mean, this is basically a French and British.
Leading from behind, I think are the words are
leading
used.
From behind, exactly, No, I mean, you see a much greater effort to reach out to allies, to work with allies, a much more cautious policy. The problem is that he did inherit Bush's war on terror. Obama didn't send the troops into Afghanistan, Bush did. Obama was then left with trying to get out of there, with honor and some measure of success, in circumstances where, of course, the United States military are now a major political force on the American scene, which the Democrats in particular cannot afford too radically to alienate.
With the Republican foreign policy, Francis Fukuyama, friend, long-time distinguished authority on American foreign policy, this is what he says about the Republican foreign policy. All of the Kissinger-era Republicans and realists have gone away, like Robert Zellick, James Baker and Brent Scowcroft. Today, the Republican Party is just a wasteland. They are total amateurs on foreign policy. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. All my Republican friends, and I consider myself in some ways an Eisenhower Republican when it comes to foreign policy, all my Republican friends from that tradition have either left the party or simply gone silent. You know, they no longer play a role. It is astonishing after, you know, the failures and errors of the Bush years that Republican foreign policy is still dominated by the neoconservatives. They dominate the institutions. They dominate the staff of the leading Republican candidates.
So they're intellectually and politically not damaged goods in the post-Bush era?
Well, I believe in the country as a whole, yes, and they are damaged. And it's also interesting that the Tea Party...
If they're such damaged goods, Anatole, why then do they have such important positions of power within the Republican establishment?
Well, because as the Republicans themselves so often say, Washington is rather different from the rest of America. Striking, for example, that the Tea Parties are, I mean, it's not that they are obviously anti-nationalist if you look at the statements by Palin and Bachmann. But if you look at the mass of the Tea Parties, they are much more sceptical about foreign policy adventures and commitments, above all foreign policy spending.
That doesn't make them realists, though, does it? They could be a form of isolationists almost, not interventionists.
Well, that's it. I mean, but they're very confused on the subject of foreign policy. I mean, there are these different traditions in American history. I mean, on the one hand, they would fight back very hard if America is attacked, but they really don't want to get into more neoconservative style occupations, state building.
Well, let's wrap it up, and I want to refer you to a Republican realist president. And 40 years ago, precisely, Richard Nixon set forth a 5-power strategy in remarks he made in Kansas City. Hardly anyone refers to them these days, but I thought I'd read you out his quote. Richard Nixon in 1971, "What we see as we look ahead, 5 years, 10 years, perhaps it is 15, but in any event within our time, we have 5 great economic powers: the United States, Western Europe, the Soviet Union, mainland China, and of course Japan. When we see the world in which we are about to move, the United States no longer is in the position of complete preeminence or predominance. Now that is not a bad thing. As a matter of fact, it can be a constructive thing. We now face a situation where 4 potential economic powers have the capacity, have the kind of people who can challenge us on every front." Now in Time magazine a few months later, he said, this is Richard Nixon, "I think it will be a safer world and a better world if we have a strong and healthy United States, Europe, Soviet Union, China and Japan, each balancing each other, an even balance." Now, can you imagine the response if Barack Obama or a Republican presidential candidate said something like that today?
Yeah. No, it's true. I mean, when I was in Washington, anyone who talked about multipolarity was defined as an enemy of the United States, and by many Democrats as well as Republicans. But I think that, in fact, I mean, Nixon was somewhat premature on that. But in fact, that is the way that the world is going, and that America will, perhaps without saying so, simply have to follow. In part because of the rise of China, in part because, of course, the need to balance against China. Actually, you already do see Americans, which is somewhat premature, by the way, talking openly about India as another pole of the world. Russia certainly regards itself, and may have to be accorded, the role of a kind of lesser pole, but within its own region, the former Soviet Union. Brazil, not very ambitious on the world stage, but is within South America, is a force which more and more is going to have to be reckoned with. And once again, I think that, you know, without necessarily saying this, the rhetoric of American exceptionalism will continue. But, you know, the sensible pragmatists in the State Department, of whom there are a great many, and in the American security establishment, will in the end come round.
Sure, but isn't the notion of American exceptionalism incompatible with the notion of multipolarity and a concert of powers, like the 1815 Congress of Vienna?
Well, you know, there's rhetoric, and then there's not realism but reality. Things that are philosophically incompatible in the end have to be adjusted, you know, all the time against actual resources. and the willingness of the American people to pay for things. I mean, in the 1990s, you know, when America seemed to be at its most supreme in the world, there was still this deep opposition on the part of ordinary Americans in the US Congress to going into Rwanda, to getting more involved in peacekeeping, or to sending troops on the ground to Kosovo. So in the end, there's always been an adjustment. I think there will go on being an adjustment.